Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 disappeared with 239 people on board on a trip from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing, China.
Hundreds of millions of dollars and the most advanced technology failed to find MH370, leaving behind a mystery for a decade. But while the world's leading experts were busy searching a distant ocean, an Indonesian fisherman named Rusli Kusmin, with his outdated GPS device, inadvertently became the sole witness to the tragedy. According to his account, in the early morning of March 8, 2014, a massive plane plunged silently into the Strait of Malacca, swaying erratically like a kite with a severed string, leaving behind a thick black smoke trail and a suffocating chemical smell. Why was such a critical clue overlooked by the entire world? Could this be the final key to unraveling the greatest mystery in aviation history? The story of Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370 has generated numerous official reports, but what makes it gripping is the account of a man who claims to have witnessed it all with his own eyes. On the night of March 8, 2014, while most of the world was asleep, an Indonesian fisherman named Rusli Kusmin was out at sea. His small wooden boat drifted along the northern entrance of the Strait of Malacca, a busy stretch of water between Malaysia and Sumatra. For fishermen in this area, it was an ordinary night. The sea was calm, the stars bright, and the hum of engines from cargo ships far away mixed with the soft splash of nets being lowered into the water. But then, something happened that would burn into his memory forever. Rusli said that just after 2:30 in the morning, he looked up and noticed a massive shape cutting across the sky. It was an airplane, much larger than anything that normally flew so low above those waters. The light seemed faint, and the aircraft moved strangely, not in the smooth, controlled way one would expect from a jet. Instead, it swayed from side to side, like a kite whose string had been snapped. Its path was uneven, zigzagging across the night sky in a way that sent a chill down his spine. There was no thunder of an explosion, no screaming roar of engines. The silence was almost more terrifying than the noise. Behind the plane, however, came a dark plume of smoke, thick and heavy, stretching out like a scar across the stars. The trail seemed endless, proof that something inside the aircraft was burning or failing. Rusli later described it as if the jet were wounded, limping through the air before surrendering to the sea. Within moments, the aircraft's angle shifted. Its nose tilted downward, and slowly but steadily, it began to lose altitude. Rusli watched as the giant silhouette sank lower, closer to the waves. He recalled that it did not fall violently, but rather drifted downward as though an invisible hand was pulling it into the ocean's embrace. Then, without warning, the plane slipped under the horizon and vanished from sight. The silence that followed was unbearable. For a man who spent his life at sea, silence usually meant peace. But this was different. It was heavy, suffocating, broken only by the sound of the tide against his boat. What unsettled Rusli and his crew even more was the smell that soon spread across the water. A sharp, acrid odor clung to the air, burning their throats and stinging their noses. It was not the smell of salt or diesel that fishermen knew well. It was chemical, toxic, the kind of smell that told them something deadly had been released into the night. Fear struck the crew. They scrambled below deck, coughing, their hearts racing, unsure of what they had just witnessed. For minutes that felt like hours, they stayed hidden, waiting for the air to clear, listening to the silence. By the time they dared return to the surface, the plane was gone. The sea showed no flames, no debris, just darkness stretching endlessly in every direction. It was as though the ocean had swallowed the aircraft whole. For Rusli, the image remained sharp. The zigzag descent, the black smoke, the strange silence, and that chemical stench, each detail seared into his mind. He later told reporters that the scene was so unreal, so terrifying, that he and his men decided to keep it secret. How could a handful of fishermen claim to have seen what the world's most advanced radars and satellites had missed? They feared no one would believe them, and worse, they feared what might happen if they spoke too soon. It would take 5 long years before Rusli decided to share his story. At a press conference in 2019, he stood before flashing cameras and skeptical reporters, raised his right hand, and swore on the Quran that every word he said was true. For a simple fisherman, this was not just testimony, it was a sacred oath, and what he revealed had the power to challenge everything the world thought it knew about MH370. This is where the mystery deepens, because Rusli did not only give his words, he also brought proof. So the question is, what evidence did this fisherman carry with him all those years, and why does it still matter today? What makes Rusli Kusmin's account different from many other eyewitness stories is that he did not only rely on memory. He claimed he captured exact coordinates of the crash site using his boat's GPS device, turning his testimony into something measurable and concrete. That night in March 2014, as the plane tilted and sank into the sea, Rusli pressed a few buttons on the simple navigator every fisherman carried to track fishing grounds. Instead of noting the best spot for tuna, he locked in the point where a giant aircraft vanished beneath the waves. He later explained that his hands shook, but his mind told him this moment was too important to ignore. The numbers displayed on the small screen were precise, and to him, they were evidence stronger than words. Once he returned home, he wrote the coordinates down on a map, marking the location carefully so he would never forget. He tucked the GPS log and the paper map deep into his records, sealed away with his fishing logs, and for years he told no one. For Rusli, these were not just numbers. They were the only proof he had that the unbelievable event had really happened. For 5 years, the coordinates stayed hidden, untouched, like a secret locked under layers of silence. During that time, the world's government spent hundreds of millions of dollars scanning the southern Indian Ocean. Families of victims waited endlessly for answers, and yet, one fisherman held a data point that matched the last radar blip recorded by the Malaysian military near Penang. The contrast could not be sharper. On one side, global searches with advanced sonar and satellites. On the other, a fisherman's GPS memory card lying in a drawer. In 2019, Rusli finally broke his silence. At a press conference filled with journalists, cameras, and skeptical eyes, he stood holding the device that had been his companion at sea. His voice shook at first, but then he swore on the Quran, placing his hand on the holy book as he declared, "I saw it with my own eyes, and here is where it happened." This oath was not casual. In his culture, swearing on the Quran is the ultimate act of honesty, one that binds a person to truth before God. For him, this was his way of saying he could not and would not invent such a story. Reporters in the room described the silence that followed his declaration. It was not the silence of disbelief, but of unease, as if the weight of his words clashed with the official story everyone had heard for years. His coordinates pointed to the Strait of Malacca, an area full of ships and fishing boats, yet almost no large-scale search had ever been carried out there. If his testimony was right, then the international search efforts had been chasing shadows thousands of miles away. Independent researchers later examined the coordinates he revealed. Some of them compared the point to ocean current models and argued that debris found years later on African beaches could have drifted naturally from that same spot. Others pointed out that the underwater geography there, with its steep drop-offs and silt-covered ledges, could easily hide a wreck from sonar scans. These arguments gave Rusli's claim more weight than a simple story. They suggested his GPS record might be a missing piece in a puzzle that had been unsolved for over a decade. Still, officials did not act. No underwater drones were dispatched to the site. No sonar sweeps were ordered. The GPS numbers remained on paper and in memory, but never tested by real exploration. For many who followed the case, this refusal to investigate added another layer of mystery. Why ignore a coordinate that matched radar data and had been sworn to on the Quran? Why leave the fisherman's evidence untouched while spending fortunes searching elsewhere? The GPS record and the oath changed Rusli's role from a witness into a whistleblower, someone whose story demanded answers. Whether people believed him or not, his evidence stood as a challenge to the official version of events. But if the coordinates and the oath were so powerful, why did the authorities keep silent? And what could explain their decision to ignore the place Rusli identified? What gave Rusli's testimony an even darker edge was the smell that spread across the water after the plane sank. He described it as sharp, acrid, and burning, a stench that scratched at the throat and forced his crew below deck. This was not the usual odor of diesel or smoke from fishing boats. It was something different, something chemical, and it matched a theory that has haunted investigators since the early days of the case. Among the cargo loaded on MH370 was a large shipment of lithium-ion batteries. These batteries power everything from phones to laptops, but they also carry a dangerous reputation. When damaged or stored improperly, they can overheat, catch fire, and release toxic fumes. Aviation safety records already list several incidents of smaller cargo fires caused by these batteries, and in some cases, the results were fatal. The International Civil Aviation Organization had even issued warnings about the risks years before the MH370 tragedy. If a fire had started in the cargo hold of the Boeing 777, it could explain many mysteries at once. Lithium-ion fires do not always explode instantly. Instead, they can smolder, spread slowly, and create thick chemical smoke. The smell described by Rusli matched exactly what such a blaze would release. His words painted a picture of a crew struggling against invisible forces inside the aircraft, fighting for control while the cabin filled with poisonous air. This scenario also explains the strange silence from the cockpit. In the case of a rapid fire, pilots may have little or no time to broadcast a distress call. The smoke could have disabled critical systems and overwhelmed the crew before they could act. Instead of clear emergency signals, what followed was confusion on the radar and a ghostly zigzag flight path over the Strait of Malacca. The erratic movements Rusli witnessed, swaying, tilting, and descending, fit the image of a plane no longer under full control. The technical side of this theory is equally haunting. Lithium-ion fires burn at extremely high temperatures, sometimes hot enough to damage the structure around them. In an enclosed space like a cargo bay, the heat could have destroyed avionics and triggered failures across the aircraft. More importantly, the toxic gases would have spread into the passenger cabin, leaving hundreds of people unconscious long before the final descent. That smell lingering in the night air above the sea may have been the last trace of those hidden flames. Yet despite the match between Rusli's account and this scenario, official reports rarely gave serious attention to the fire hypothesis. The main focus always returned to satellite data and the southern Indian Ocean. To acknowledge a cargo fire would have meant raising questions about airline safety standards, shipping practices, and regulatory failures. It would also have placed responsibility on institutions that preferred a simpler explanation, that the plane flew south until its fuel ran out. By ignoring the chemical clue, investigators kept their story tidy, but at the cost of leaving important evidence unexplored. Independent researchers, however, have argued that the fire theory remains one of the most consistent ways to connect the eyewitness account with the technical data. They point out that the sudden loss of communication, the lack of distress calls, and the wobbling descent all mirror what could happen during a lithium-ion fire. Combined with the pungent smell witnessed from the surface, the pieces form a chilling possibility that the plane was already doomed long before it reached the open ocean. If this explanation is true, it changes how we see the final hours of MH370. Instead of a deliberate act of sabotage or a controlled diversion into remote seas, the tragedy may have begun with something as simple as unstable cargo. The smallest spark, hidden deep in the hold, could have spiraled into a disaster that no pilot or system could fully stop. But if the smell and the fire theory offered such a clear lead, why was the focus of the search placed thousands of miles away, ignoring the Strait of Malacca altogether? The most puzzling part of the MH370 investigation is how the Strait of Malacca was overlooked, even though it matched both radar data and Rusli's coordinates. After the last civilian radar contact near the South China Sea, Malaysian military radar tracked the aircraft, making a sharp turn back across the peninsula. The final blip appeared just west of Penang at 2:22 a.m., placing the jet directly above one of the busiest waterways in Southeast Asia. Hundreds of ships pass through this narrow corridor every night, and countless fishing boats crowd its surface. Logically, this should have been one of the first areas to be searched, yet no major underwater mission ever happened there. Instead, attention shifted thousands of miles away. Analysts relied heavily on Inmarsat's satellite pings, interpreting the data to suggest the jet had continued flying for hours until it ran out of fuel in the southern Indian Ocean. This interpretation became the foundation of the most expensive aviation search in history, costing over $150 million and covering more than 120,000 square kilometers of seabed. While fleets of ships and planes combed the deep ocean southwest of Australia, the shallow and accessible waters of Malacca remained almost untouched. Officials defended this decision by saying that if a crash had occurred in such a crowded strait, wreckage would have been discovered immediately. They also argued that radar signals and drift models pointed firmly south. But critics argued that this reasoning ignored human testimony, underestimated the complexity of currents, and dismissed the possibility that the wreck could be hidden in trenches or covered by silt. Rusli's coordinates matched the radar's last known contact, were filed away and forgotten. This choice created suspicion. Why would investigators pour resources into one of the most remote parts of the planet while leaving a busy strategic waterway unchecked? Was it simply overconfidence in satellite data, or was there a deeper reason to avoid searching near populated coastlines? The silence from authorities only fueled more questions, and it set the stage for one of the most controversial debates in the MH370 mystery. But if the Malacca Strait was ignored, then what happened when independent researchers started testing Rusli's location against debris and ocean current models? When Rusli finally revealed his coordinates and testimony, many expected that officials would rush to verify them. Instead, what followed was silence, and that silence became as shocking as the claim itself. Yet no ships were sent to the spot, no divers dropped into the Malacca Strait, and no effort was made to confirm or deny his account. The coordinates were accepted into files but left to gather dust. For families of the victims, this indifference felt like another loss, as if answers were being withheld by choice. Critics pointed to the huge contrast in resources. While more than $150 million were poured into searching remote areas of the Indian Ocean, not a fraction of that was spent exploring the waters closest to Rusli's claim. The official narrative leaned entirely on Inmarsat's satellite data, but investigators showed no interest in balancing that theory with human testimony. For some, this looked less like an oversight and more like an intentional decision to avoid uncomfortable truths. The idea of a cover-up soon entered the conversation. Searching the Strait of Malacca would have raised difficult questions about radar monitoring, response times, and possible security failures. If the wreck was found close to land, it would show that detection systems failed to alert authorities in time, and that could damage reputations at the highest levels. By steering the investigation south, focus shifted away from these sensitive issues and toward an ocean so vast that failure could be excused as inevitable. For Rusli, the silence was crushing. His story, backed by faith and evidence, was treated as inconvenient noise. Independent researchers voiced concern, but without government support, their calls for action faded into the background.
Of course we did.
What remained was a feeling that the world preferred a mystery in the open ocean rather than answers hidden near busy shores. If the silence was deliberate, then what could motivate such resistance, and how did independent scientists later test his location against real debris and ocean models? While authorities turned their attention to the deep waters of the Indian Ocean, a small group of independent researchers chose to revisit Rusli's coordinates. They asked a simple question: could his point in the Strait of Malacca actually explain the debris that washed up on distant African shores? To test the theory, they used oceanographic drift models, the same kind of tools scientists rely on to track pollution or missing vessels. By running simulations backward from where confirmed MH370 fragments had been found, on Reunion Island, Madagascar, Mozambique, and Tanzania, they discovered that the current paths lined up more closely with Rusli's location than with some of the official zones far to the south. The idea was startling because it suggested that debris might indeed have started from the spot he recorded. Their analysis also considered the seafloor. The Malacca Strait may seem crowded with ships on the surface, but beneath the waves it holds deep trenches and steep slopes. Experts argued that large wreckage could slide into these natural pockets and remain invisible to surface scans or even early sonar sweeps. In other words, the crash site could have been hiding in plain sight, shielded by geography rather than distance. These findings gave new strength to the fisherman's claim. Instead of being a lonely voice, Rusli's story is now connected with science, currents, and the physical landscape. Even though he was not a pilot or engineer, his GPS entry suddenly carried weight against high-level calculations. Researchers warned that ignoring such alignment between data and eyewitness testimony was a dangerous mistake. Still, no official search followed. Families of victims, already exhausted by years of waiting, called again for exploration in the Malacca Strait, but their pleas went unanswered. The independent studies were published, shared, and debated online, yet they never shifted the focus of the main investigation. To many, it felt as though the simplest path had been deliberately avoided. If debris and currents pointed back to Malacca, and if the seafloor there could easily hide a wreck, then why was the theory never fully tested? Could it be that the truth was not only inconvenient, but perhaps too close to reveal? The final and most unsettling theory is that MH370 was never supposed to be discovered at all. When evidence is ignored, when eyewitnesses are dismissed, and when coordinates that match radar data are left unsearched, the idea of a simple accident begins to fade. Supporters of this view argue that if the wreck had been found in the Strait of Malacca, it would have forced authorities to face failures in radar defense, communication, and emergency response. A crash so close to land in busy waters filled with ships would expose serious weaknesses. By steering the investigation toward the southern Indian Ocean, officials created a narrative that shifted blame onto nature, portraying the tragedy as something lost to the vastness of the sea. The remoteness of that location made failure acceptable, while the truth near Malacca would have been harder to explain. The phrase "never meant to be found" has since become tied to MH370. It reflects the frustration of families who feel that they have been misled, and the suspicion of researchers who see patterns in the silence. If Rusli's account is accurate, then the plane's disappearance is not just about a crash, but about a decision to bury reality beneath layers of data and bureaucracy. The unanswered question is whether this decision was born from incompetence, fear of blame, or something even more deliberate. Independent voices continue to press for action. They argue that technology today is far more advanced than it was in 2014, and that underwater drones could scan the Strait of Malacca quickly and at a fraction of the cost of earlier searches. Yet even now, no mission has been launched in the zone marked by Rusli's GPS. The idea that one of the greatest mysteries of modern aviation could be solved but remains ignored adds weight to the suspicion of intentional silence. So the question remains, was MH370 a tragic accident that spiraled out of control, or was it a tragedy that someone decided should remain hidden forever? The disappearance of Malaysia Airlines. Flight MH370 remains a painful scar in aviation history, but the testimony of Indonesian fisherman Rusli Kusmin has ignited a glimmer of hope in unraveling the mystery. Using his outdated GPS device, he recorded the precise coordinates where the plane plunged into the Strait of Malacca, matching the final radar traces. His account, sworn on the Quran, described the aircraft's erratic movements, black smoke, and a toxic chemical smell, consistent with the hypothesis of a lithium battery fire in the cargo hold. Despite the compelling evidence supported by independent researchers, it was suspiciously overlooked by official search efforts. Rusli's actions demonstrate that truth is often uncovered through conscience and persistence, not just expensive technology or complex reports. It reminds us to always listen to genuine voices, no matter how small, and to persistently seek justice for unresolved destinies.